And I would like to start by thanking in particular my colleagues, Professor Bigliardi and Professor Pascucci, for their kindness and for their invite. My contribution will be very, very brief, and I think what I would like to do is to say that our research here at the ETUI very much supports and reinforces the key message that the festival is pursuing. At risk of oversimplifying, much more subtle analysis of the trajectory of health and safety at work, accidents and prevention in Europe in the last few decades, I would like to suggest that the big picture on health and safety trends in Europe in the last 3 decades has been more or less the following. On the one hand, the narrative goes, deaths at work have been going down, and they have been going down systematically since the adoption of the OSH Framework Directive in 1989. They're now a fraction of what they were. And in a way, this is excellent news. There is, of course, a certain degree of complacency whenever this type of narrative emerges. We give each other and ourselves a big pat on the shoulder. Excellent news. The other side of this narrative is that we all recognize that just as deaths at work and to a certain extent accidents at work have been going down in the past 30 years, mental health issues at work, stress and work-related stress in particular, have been going up, especially when measured and counted as working days lost in connection to such mental health issues. But today, the story goes, deaths and accidents at work are down. Mental health issues are determined by a very broad range of factors, including social factors, technological factors not necessarily connected to the workplace, personal factors, individual fragilities, all of them outside the control of the enterprise, all outside the control of the organization. I think this is where your excellent initiative comes in order to rectify this narrative. In reality, experts such as yourselves and my expert colleagues here at the ETUI tell us that the picture is much more complex than this oversimplified narrative. First of all, unfortunately, in some member states, although even deaths at work have been decreasing historically, they have been on the rise in the last 2 or 3 years. Italy, of course, is one such example of a member state in which deaths have been going up, especially during and since the pandemic. Malta, Cyprus, there's quite a few countries actually, when you look at it, where deaths at work have either flatlined or have actually been going up. What is also on the rise is work-related illnesses. And I think this is something that we really need to monitor extremely carefully. MEP Mr. Bonifay before just relayed very, very clearly the impact that the two transitions are having on the world of work, the ecological and the digital transition. Well, as part of the ecological transition, over the next decade, perhaps less than so, we will have to address the eco-sustainability of some 35 million dwellings in Europe, all full of asbestos, all of them built in the days in which asbestos was routinely used for construction work. That is 35 million buildings that will have to be either dispatched or renewed. And there is a serious question about the levels of asbestos that we can clearly put up with at the moment under current regulation. Asbestos is, of course, the kind of disease that shows its effects 1 or even 2 or 3 decades after exposure. I would also like to point out what you have been saying so far, that the digital transition engenders significant risks for both our mental health, but also for our physical health. And it's important to remember this. as far as psychosocial risks are concerned, until the labor force survey of 2020, data were only being recovered in respect of harassment at work, violence and threat of violence at work, and time pressure and overload at work. But since 2020, additional data have been gathered, in particular, including organizational elements, and this has led to a significant growth in the incidence of psychosocial risk factors. So I think there is a clear question, a clear diagnostic tool question here in respect of monitoring the impact of psychosocial risks as connected to the relatively new phenomena linked to the digital transition. The more our diagnostic tools, the more we're able to gather data about psychosocial risk, the greater the problem. Is very similar to the situation we were confronted with during the COVID pandemic. If you don't test, there is no COVID. The minute you start testing, and testing well, COVID is a big issue. It's exactly the same for psychosocial risks. We're not asking the right questions, but the more we ask the right questions, and thanks to your project, the questions are becoming increasingly clearer, the bigger the issue of psychosocial risk is going to be. Aside from the definition of psychosocial risk, there is also a clear question about having a common understanding and a common framework of what amounts to psychosocial risks. At the moment, the data and the information we have here at the ETUI suggests that there is a plurality of very different national understandings of the concept of psychosocial risks. This is something that needs to be rectified at the European level. And I think it's certainly about time that increased progress is made on an idea, on a proposal of a European directive on psychosocial risks. And again, I can see projects such as yours making important contribution along that path. Finally, and to conclude, I would like to say that the digital transition, the digital revolution, also involves risks that are not purely and simply psychosocial risks, but are not also physical risks alone. They are a mix of the two. The human-robot interaction is highly imperfect at the moment, and we're going to see more of that in the future. We have questions and research going on in the ETUI about the impact of the use of exoskeletons are having not just on the physical well-being of humans, but also on their mental well-being. There is, of course, a plethora of research about the effect of the intensification of work processes on mental and physical well-being in certain warehouses run by certain multinationals, once book delivery company and now generalist trading company. And the data is staggering. We're talking about 50% more accidents, physical accidents at work, and a terrible impact on people's mental well-being. Again, this is a process, this is a debate that still awaits to be charted, and I think, again, it's projects such as the festival and the interaction of so many stakeholders that will allow us eventually to do that. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for your work. We're following it very, very closely and with the greatest interest. Thank you.